July 14, 1985, and the St. Petersburg Beach Boardwalk in Florida was packed with tourists and locals enjoying the summer Sunday afternoon, with families strolling along the wooden walkway that stretched for half a mile along the Gulf Coast. The boardwalk featured shops selling souvenirs and ice cream, street performers entertaining crowds, and spectacular views of the white sand beach and turquoise water that drew millions of visitors to Florida's West Coast annually. Rachel Monroe was 6 years old that Sunday, a petite girl with straight blonde hair cut into a bob, bright blue eyes, and a constellation of freckles across her nose and cheeks. She wore a pink sundress with white polka dots, white sandals, and a white sun hat with a ribbon that her mother had insisted she wear to protect her fair skin from the intense Florida sun. Rachel had come to the boardwalk with her mother, Diane Monroe, a divorced single parent who worked as a real estate agent and was spending the day at the beach with her daughter before a busy work week. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Diane and Rachel were watching a street performer juggling flaming torches about midway along the boardwalk, standing with a crowd of maybe 40 people gathered in a semicircle around the performer. The juggler was talented and entertaining, keeping the audience captivated with his routine, and Diane had her hands on Rachel's shoulders as they stood together watching the show. At 3:42 p.m., the juggling performance concluded with an impressive finale, and the crowd erupted in applause while the performer took bows and collected tips in a hat passed around the audience. During the applause and the movement of people reaching for wallets and shifting positions, the crowd became compressed and chaotic for approximately 30 to 40 seconds as people prepared to disperse. Diane felt Rachel slip away from under her hands in the crush of people, and she assumed her daughter had just stepped forward or to the side to avoid being jostled by adults moving around. But when the crowd began dispersing and Diane looked down expecting to see Rachel beside her, her daughter was nowhere visible in the immediate area, and panic began rising in Diane's chest. Diane called Rachel's name and spun around, checking in all directions, thinking her daughter must have stepped away to look at something, or had gotten confused in the crowd movement and wandered a few feet in the wrong direction. Within seconds, Diane was pushing through the departing crowd, asking people if they'd seen a 6-year-old girl in a pink sundress and white sun hat, but people shook their heads and continued walking. The street performer was packing up his equipment, and Diane frantically asked him if he'd seen where Rachel had gone, but he'd been focused on collecting tips and hadn't noticed any particular child in the crowd. By 3:45 p.m., Diane was screaming Rachel's name and running along the boardwalk, checking shops and benches, and other people began helping search the immediate area, realizing a child was missing. At 3:50 p.m., beach security was alerted, and within minutes several guards were searching the boardwalk and beach area, while announcements were broadcast asking Rachel Monroe to come to the information booth. In approximately 30 to 40 seconds, during the chaos of a crowd applauding and dispersing after a street performance, 6-year-old Rachel Monroe vanished from a Florida boardwalk with hundreds of people around. If you want to hear how this little girl was finally identified after 38 years in shocking circumstances, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue. St. Petersburg police arrived at 4:00 p.m., and Officer Michael Torres immediately coordinated a search expanding from the boardwalk to surrounding streets and parking areas, looking for any sign of Rachel or witnesses who'd seen what happened. The white sun hat Rachel had been wearing was found on the boardwalk near where the street performance had been, and this discovery was alarming because Rachel wouldn't have removed it voluntarily, given how much her mother had emphasized wearing it. Diane was interviewed about the exact sequence of events and whether Rachel had any reason to wander off, but Diane insisted her daughter was obedient and would never walk away without permission, especially in a crowded place. The street performer was questioned extensively about what he'd seen during and after his performance, and while he remembered seeing a little girl in pink in the audience, he couldn't recall seeing her leave or anyone interacting with her. Detective Robert Chen arrived at 4:30 p.m. and immediately treated the case as a potential abduction given the circumstances, and he organized interviews with everyone who'd been in the crowd watching the juggling performance. Several witnesses remembered seeing Rachel during the performance standing with her mother, but nobody could recall seeing her after the applause started, and nobody had witnessed anyone taking her or leading her away. The theory emerged that someone had grabbed Rachel during those chaotic 30 to 40 seconds, when the crowd was compressed and distracted, using the confusion to take the child quickly before anyone noticed. Bloodhounds were brought from Tampa by 5:30 p.m. and given Rachel's scent from a sweater in Diane's car, and the dogs tracked from where the street performance had been toward the boardwalk's north parking area before losing the trail. The fact that the scent ended in the parking lot suggested Rachel had been placed in a vehicle, and investigators began identifying every car that had been parked in that area during the critical time frame. Detective Chen interviewed beach security about surveillance cameras, but in 1985 the boardwalk had minimal camera coverage, and the few cameras that existed were positioned at building entrances rather than covering open areas. One camera at a nearby gift shop had captured part of the crowd watching the street performance, and investigators reviewed the grainy footage hoping to see Rachel or identify anyone who might have taken her. The footage showed the crowd during the performance, and Rachel was briefly visible in her pink dress and white hat, standing with her mother. But when the applause started and people began moving, the crowd blocked clear views. When the crowd dispersed approximately a minute later, Rachel was no longer visible in any frame, and investigators couldn't identify anyone who appeared to be carrying or leading a child away from the area. Detective Chen focused investigation on the street performer, questioning whether he might have been working with an accomplice who'd grabbed Rachel while everyone's attention was on the juggling finale. The performer, a man named David Walsh from Orlando, was investigated thoroughly with background checks and polygraph testing, but he had no criminal history and passed all examinations, and he was eventually cleared. FBI was contacted given the potential for abduction and interstate trafficking, and Special Agent Catherine Wells arrived from the Miami field office with resources and expertise from similar cases. Agent Wells interviewed Diane extensively about her life and relationships, looking for anyone who might have motive to take Rachel, but Diane was estranged from her ex-husband who lived in California and had no custody issues or concerning contacts. Rachel's biological father had minimal involvement in her life and was verified to have been in Los Angeles at the time of the disappearance, and background investigation found no connection to Florida or reason to suspect his involvement. By Monday, the case had become major news across Florida, with Rachel's photo appearing on television showing her blonde bob and bright smile, and the pink polka dot sundress became a key identifying feature. Tips flooded in from people claiming to have seen Rachel at various locations, but every reported sighting was investigated and found to be other blonde girls with similar features. One witness reported seeing a woman hurrying through the north parking lot, carrying a child wrapped in a beach towel around 3:50 p.m., but the description was too vague to be useful, and the witness couldn't say if the child had been struggling. This lead was investigated extensively, with police trying to identify the woman and vehicle, but hundreds of people had been in the parking lot that afternoon, and the witness couldn't provide specific enough details. By late July, the intensive search had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Rachel, despite thousands of volunteer hours and extensive professional investigation covering St. Petersburg and surrounding areas. Diane quit her real estate job and devoted herself entirely to searching for Rachel, distributing flyers and maintaining a tip hotline, and she appeared regularly on television, keeping the case in public consciousness. The case was featured on America's Most Wanted in early 1986, and the broadcast generated thousands of tips. But as with previous leads, investigation revealed each was either mistaken identity or well-meaning but inaccurate information. By 1990, the case had essentially gone cold with periodic reviews but no active investigation, and Rachel Monroe became another child who'd vanished from a crowded public place despite her mother being right there. Age progression photos were created showing what Rachel might look like at 10, 15, 25, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases as technology advanced over the decades. Diane never remarried or had other children, unable to move forward from July 14, 1985, when she'd felt Rachel slip away in a crowd and had lost her daughter forever in seconds. She became an advocate for missing children, working with organizations to improve security at tourist areas and pushing for better surveillance camera coverage at public spaces, channeling her grief into activism. The white sun hat that had been found on the boardwalk was preserved as evidence, one of the few physical items connected to Rachel's disappearance, and Diane kept it in a box with other mementos of her daughter. By 2020, Rachel would have been 41 years old, and Diane held memorial services each July 14th at the boardwalk, standing near where the street performance had been and remembering the daughter she'd lost. The years passed with agonizing slowness for Diane Monroe, with 1985 becoming 2000 and then 2010, and Rachel's bedroom remained exactly as it had been, filled with toys and books for a 6-year-old who'd never returned home. Detective James Harrison took over the cold case in 2010, and he was troubled by how little physical evidence existed beyond the sun hat and the grainy surveillance footage that showed nothing conclusive about what had happened. Harrison used modern databases and technology to search for adults who might match Rachel's age and general description, but had questionable origin stories or gaps in their early childhood documentation. He also investigated whether Rachel's disappearance might be connected to other missing children from Florida tourist areas in the 1980s, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial predator operating along the coast. Several cases shared similarities with Rachel's, but attempts to connect them to a single perpetrator found no concrete evidence linking the disappearances beyond the general location and time frame. By 2023, Rachel would have been 44 years old, and Diane, now 73 and in declining health, continued her vigil, though she'd accepted intellectually that her daughter had likely died in 1985. True crime podcasts rediscovered Rachel's case in the early 2020s, and several shows featured detailed episodes about the Boardwalk disappearance and the 30 to 40-second window when she'd vanished from her mother's side. In September 2023, a woman named Karen Phillips died in a car accident in Georgia, and during the routine investigation, authorities discovered disturbing items in her home that suggested a dark secret. Among Karen's possessions were dozens of newspaper clippings about missing children from the 1980s and 1990s, including multiple articles about Rachel Monroe's disappearance from the St. Petersburg Boardwalk. More disturbingly, investigators found a box hidden in Karen's attic containing children's clothing from the 1980s, including a pink sundress with white polka dots that matched the description of what Rachel had been wearing. Georgia Bureau of Investigation contacted Florida authorities about the findings, and Detective Sarah Chen from Florida's Cold Case Unit immediately recognized the potential connection to Rachel's case. Chen traveled to Georgia to examine Karen Phillips's possessions, and among the items she found a journal, where Karen had written extensively about saving a child from an unfit mother in Florida in 1985. The journal entries were disturbing, describing how Karen had watched families at tourist locations and had identified a little girl who she believed needed rescuing from a mother who worked too much. Karen had written about following the mother and child to the boardwalk, watching them at the street performance and taking the opportunity during the crowd chaos to grab the child and carry her away wrapped in a beach towel. "She came with me so easily," one entry read. "She thought I was helping her find her mother in the crowd, and by the time she realized something was wrong, we were already at my car and driving away." The journal described taking the child to Georgia and raising her as Emma Phillips, telling people she'd adopted the girl privately, and working to make the child forget her previous life and accept her new identity. But the journal ended in 1995, with no further entries about Emma or what had happened to the child Karen claimed to have taken from Florida, and this gap troubled investigators. Detective Chen obtained a warrant to exhume Karen Phillips's body for DNA comparison, and she also searched for any records of a child named Emma Phillips, who would have been raised by Karen in Georgia. The search revealed that Karen had indeed raised a daughter named Emma, and records showed Emma had attended schools in Georgia during the late 1980s and 1990s, but there was no documentation of her existence before 1985. Emma Phillips had apparently lived with Karen until approximately 1995, when she would have been 16, and then the records became unclear, with no graduation records or clear documentation of what happened to her afterward. Chen used databases to search for Emma Phillips and found dozens of women with that name across the country, but narrowing down which one might be Rachel Monroe based on age and location proved challenging. DNA comparison between Karen Phillips and the pink sundress found in her attic confirmed the presence of biological material that could potentially be tested against Rachel's genetic profile if it had been preserved. Diane Monroe was contacted in October 2023 with the shocking news that evidence had been found suggesting Karen Phillips had abducted Rachel, and that her daughter might still be alive somewhere as a woman named Emma Phillips. "After 38 years of not knowing," Diane said through tears, "to learn that someone wrote about taking Rachel, that she might be alive out there not knowing who she really is, I don't know whether to feel hope or devastation." Detective Chen launched an intensive search for Emma Phillips, using age and location parameters to identify women born around 1979 who'd been raised by Karen Phillips in Georgia during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The challenge was that Emma had apparently disappeared from records around age 16 in 1995, suggesting she might have run away, changed her name, or experienced some other life disruption that caused her to lose contact with Karen. Chen used social media, employment records, and genealogical databases to track down possible leads, and she identified approximately 20 women named Emma Phillips in the right age range across multiple states. Each potential Emma was investigated, with Chen's team checking birth certificates, school records, and family histories to determine which one might be the girl Karen Phillips had taken from the St. Petersburg Boardwalk. The pink sundress found in Karen's attic was processed for DNA, and forensic scientists were able to extract genetic material that could be compared against Diane Monroe's DNA to confirm if the dress had belonged to Rachel. The DNA comparison took 6 weeks, and when results came back in November 2023, they showed a 99.9% match to Diane Monroe, confirming that the pink polka dot sundress had indeed been worn by Rachel. This confirmation proved that Karen Phillips had taken Rachel Monroe, but it didn't answer the critical question of where Rachel was now, or if she was even still alive. Chen discovered that in 1995, when Emma would have been 16, Karen had reported her daughter as a runaway, claiming Emma had left home after an argument and hadn't been seen since. But Georgia police records from 1995 showed the runaway report had been handled minimally, with officers taking basic information but conducting no extensive search for a teenage runaway who might have left voluntarily. Chen theorized that Emma might have discovered the truth about her origins as a teenager, perhaps finding newspaper clippings or overhearing something that made her realize Karen wasn't her biological mother. This revelation could have triggered Emma to run away, searching for her real identity, or could have caused conflict that led to some other outcome that Karen had covered up by reporting her as a runaway. The search intensified with FBI resources joining the effort, and agents began checking unidentified remains from the mid-1990s in Georgia and surrounding states, looking for any that might match Emma's age and description. Simultaneously, investigators used genealogical DNA databases to search for genetic relatives of Diane Monroe, who might lead them to Rachel if she was alive, and had submitted DNA for ancestry testing. In January 2024, the genealogical search produced a hit. A woman named Emma Richardson in North Carolina had DNA showing she was a close biological match to Diane Monroe, consistent with being her daughter. Emma Richardson, age 44 and working as a nurse in Charlotte, was contacted by Detective Chen, and she was confused about why law enforcement was asking about her family background. "I was adopted," Emma told Chen. "Or at least that's what Karen told me. She said my birth mother died when I was little and she'd taken me in. But I never had documentation and always wondered about my real origins." Emma explained that she'd run away from Karen's home at 16 after finding newspaper clippings about missing children and realizing Karen had been lying about her past, and she'd spent years trying to piece together who she really was. "I knew something was wrong," Emma said. "I had these fragmented memories of beaches and a different life, memories Karen said were dreams, but they felt too real to be imaginary, and finding those clippings confirmed my suspicions." Emma had changed her last name to Richardson when she'd gotten married at 23, and she'd submitted DNA to ancestry websites in recent years, hoping to find biological relatives who could tell her the truth about her origins. Detective Chen requested formal DNA testing to compare Emma Richardson's genetic profile against Diane Monroe's, and the analysis took 4 weeks with results coming back in February 2024. The DNA results showed a 99.98% probability that Emma Richardson was biologically Rachel Monroe, the child who disappeared from a Florida boardwalk 38 years earlier during a street performance. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the true crime community and made international headlines. Rachel Monroe had been found alive at age 44, living in North Carolina under the name Emma Richardson, having escaped her abductor at 16. Diane Monroe received the call from Detective Chen on a Tuesday afternoon, learning that her daughter was alive, had been alive the entire time, and had actually escaped from her kidnapper decades earlier, but hadn't known how to find her way home. "Rachel is alive and she's been trying to find me," Diane sobbed. "She ran away from that woman and spent years looking for answers, and we were both searching for each other all this time without knowing how to connect." The reunion between Diane and Emma was arranged for March 2024 in a neutral location with therapists present, and both women approached the meeting with 38 years of grief, loss, and unanswered questions creating overwhelming emotions. Diane recognized elements of Rachel and Emma's face despite nearly 4 decades of aging, and she brought childhood photos and videos to show Emma the little girl she'd been before Karen Phillips had taken her from the boardwalk. "I never stopped looking for you," Diane said through tears. "Every single day for 38 years I wondered where you were, if you were alive, if you were safe, and I blamed myself for letting you slip away in that crowd." Emma looked at photos of herself as Rachel in the pink polka dot sundress, and while most memories of her early childhood remained frustratingly inaccessible, seeing the images triggered emotional responses she couldn't fully explain. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to figure out who I was," Emma told Diane. "I knew Karen had lied to me. I knew something terrible had happened, but I had no way to find you or even know your name until now." The two women embraced crying, mother and daughter reunited after 38 years of separation, and they began the difficult process of building a relationship across decades of missed experiences. Emma explained that after running away at 16, she'd lived on the streets briefly before finding shelter programs, and she'd worked multiple jobs while putting herself through nursing school, determined to build a life despite not knowing her origins. She'd gotten married at 23 to a man named James Richardson, who'd supported her despite the mysteries surrounding her past, and they'd raised 2 children who were now teenagers themselves. Detective Chen's investigation confirmed that Karen Phillips had taken Rachel during the chaos of the crowd applause, wrapping her in a beach towel she'd been carrying and walking quickly to her car before anyone realized what had happened. Karen had driven immediately from Florida to Georgia with Rachel, and over the following weeks she'd convinced the 6-year-old that her previous memories were dreams, and that she was Karen's adopted daughter Emma. The journal entries showed that Karen had isolated Emma initially, homeschooling her and moving frequently to prevent questions, and she'd gradually introduced her to neighbors as her legally adopted daughter. By the time Emma was old enough to attend public school at age 8, she'd accepted her identity and had suppressed most memories of life before Karen, making her appear to be a normal child with no red flags. The fact that Karen Phillips had died in 2023 meant she could never be held legally accountable for kidnapping Rachel, and this reality was difficult for Diane to accept despite her relief at finding her daughter alive. "She lived free for 38 years, Diane told reporters. "She took my baby and raised her as her own, and she died without ever facing justice for what she did. But at least I have Rachel back now." Emma struggled with complex feelings about Karen, unable to completely hate the woman who'd raised her even knowing she'd been kidnapped, because Karen had provided for her and given her stability until the truth began emerging. "Karen gave me skills and education," Emma explained, "but she also stole my childhood and my real mother, and those are 38 years we can never get back, and that's something I have to process for the rest of my life." Florida authorities officially closed Rachel Monroe's case as solved, and the story made international headlines as a rare example of a long-term missing child found alive as an adult who'd escaped her abductor. The case brought renewed attention to the importance of DNA databases and genealogical research in solving cold cases, and it inspired other adults with questionable origins to investigate their backgrounds. Emma established a foundation supporting adults who discover they were kidnapped as children, providing resources for DNA testing, therapy, and legal assistance in reclaiming identities and reconnecting with biological families. The St. Petersburg Boardwalk installed a memorial near where the street performance had been held in 1985, with a plaque reading, "Rachel Monroe, taken 1985, found alive 2023, a testament to hope and a mother's love." Diane and Emma developed a close relationship over the following year, with Emma traveling frequently to Florida to spend time with her biological mother and learn about the family and heritage that had been stolen from her. Emma introduced Diane to her grandchildren, who were fascinated to learn about their grandmother in Florida and the dramatic story of how their mother had been a missing child who'd been found decades later. "I have 2 families now," Emma told a documentary filmmaker. "The one I built as Emma Richardson while searching for my origins, and the one I was born into as Rachel Monroe, and I'm grateful to finally have both." The therapeutic process of integrating her identities and processing the trauma of being kidnapped took years, and Emma worked with specialists who helped her understand that both Rachel and Emma were authentic parts of who she was. Patricia died peacefully in 2028 at age 78, 5 years after being reunited with Rachel, and she died knowing that her daughter was alive, safe, thriving, and had never forgotten her despite decades of manipulation. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her daughter Rachel, found alive after 38 years, and that she dedicated her life to advocating for missing children and never giving up hope. The story of Rachel Monroe, taken at age 6 from a Florida boardwalk, and found 38 years later as Emma Richardson, after escaping her abductor as a teenager, stands as one of the most remarkable missing persons cases ever resolved. It demonstrates that children can be stolen in seconds during moments of chaos, that they can survive and even escape years later, and that DNA technology can reunite families even when decades have passed. And in St. Petersburg, Florida, where a little girl in a pink sundress once stood watching a street performer with her mother, her story lives on as proof that stolen children can find their way home even after nearly 4 decades. Emma continues her foundation work while maintaining her nursing career and relationships with both her North Carolina family and her Florida family, living proof that even the most tragic cases can have miraculous resolutions. The white sun hat that Rachel had been wearing that July day was returned to Emma, and she keeps it in her home as a tangible connection to the 6-year-old she was and the mother who never stopped searching for her.